Some debts are paid in silence, others are paid in blood. Astrid Vance learned the difference on the night her stepfather handed her to a man whose name alone made grown men forget how to breathe. She didn't scream. That was the part nobody expected. She had been doing the books for the Renwick household since she was 16, first as a way to prove her usefulness, then as a way to survive. Numbers were honest in a way people never were. A column either balanced or it didn't. There was no arguing with arithmetic, no talking your way around a deficit. Astrid understood that. She also understood, by the time she was 23, that the Renwick family's accounts were a disaster dressed up in expensive wallpaper and a Westchester zip code. Renwick, her mother's second husband, the man who had worn a blazer to the funeral and asked about the estate before the casseroles stopped coming, had been bleeding the family dry for years. Bad investments wrapped in good vocabulary, shell companies with pleasant names, a secondary mortgage on the house that her mother had left specifically to Astrid, buried in paperwork so dense that even the estate attorney had missed it the first time through. Astrid hadn't missed it. She'd flagged it on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the folder spread in front of her and a cup of coffee gone cold at her elbow. She'd highlighted the clause in yellow and set it on Renwick's desk the next morning with a yellow sticky note that said simply, "We need to talk." They talked, or rather, Renwick talked. He explained, smoothly, with the particular confidence of a man who had never been seriously questioned, that the mortgage had been a practical necessity, that her mother had known about it, that Astrid was being paranoid and frankly a little ungrateful, given everything he'd done for her since her mother passed. Astrid listened. She looked at him across the desk, the mahogany desk that had been her father's, the real one before the accident, and she thought, "He's afraid of me." She filed the documentation with the county clerk the following Friday. By the weekend, she understood that this had been a mistake. Not legally. Legally, she was airtight. But Renwick had a different way of settling accounts. His stepsister, Pauline, arrived Sunday evening with two men Astrid had never seen before. Pauline was the kind of woman who wore silk even to deliver bad news, maybe especially then. She sat across from Astrid in the sitting room and explained the situation with the brisk efficiency of someone reading from a document. Renwick owed money. Not to a bank, not to an investment firm, to Cade Thorne. Pauline let the name land. She watched Astrid's face for the recognition, and Astrid gave her nothing, which seemed to frustrate her. "You know who that is," Pauline said. "No," Astrid said. "I don't." "Then you're the only person in the tri-state area who doesn't." What Astrid did know in the following 48 hours was assembled from fragments, a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear, a name that kept appearing in documents she found in Renwick's study while he was at dinner with his attorney. Cade Thorne, 41 years old, head of the Thorne syndicate, which operated out of a legitimate property holding company with offices in Midtown and less legitimate operations in 4 states. The FBI had opened and closed 3 investigations. Nothing had ever stuck. The debt Renwick owed him was significant, the kind of significant that didn't come with a payment plan. Astrid was the payment plan. She found this out on a Thursday from Pauline, delivered with the same silk-wearing efficiency as before. Renwick stood in the corner of the room and did not look at her. That was the part she would think about later. Not the words, but the way he studied the floor molding, like he was pricing it for replacement. "It's temporary," Pauline said, which was either a lie or the most useless reassurance in the history of the English language. "A formality. You'll be in his household. You'll be kept, like a coat in a cloakroom, like a number in a ledger." Astrid looked at Renwick. "This is your solution." He said nothing. "I want that on record," she said, "not for any legal reason. I just want you to have heard yourself." She didn't run. She had thought, briefly, about running, about calling the one friend she still had from before, about the $2,000 in a savings account that was actually in her name, about a bus ticket to somewhere else. She thought about all of it. And then she thought about what it would mean for Renwick to win, to hand her a crisis and watch her collapse into it, to be exactly what he'd always treated her as, a footnote, a burden, a rounding error on someone else's spreadsheet. She packed a single bag, her laptop, the documentation she'd filed with the county clerk, copied onto a thumb drive, her mother's watch, which she wore on her left wrist, a change of clothes. She walked out of the house on her own 2 feet, which was the only thing she had total control over. The car that came for her was black and said nothing about itself. The driver said less. Astrid sat in the back with her bag in her lap and watched the city slide past the windows and thought about numbers, specifically about what she knew and what she didn't know and what the gap between those 2 things might cost her. What she knew, Renwick's debt to Thorne was approximately $2.3 million, based on documents she'd found. The interest rate, if there was one, was not documented anywhere she'd located, which meant either it didn't exist or it existed in a form that wasn't written down. What she didn't know, everything else. The car stopped in front of a building in a neighborhood that had clearly been expensive for a long time, and showed no signs of stopping. No doorman, but there was a man in a dark coat who opened the car door without being asked. He didn't touch her, he stepped back and waited. She got out of the car on her own. The lobby was all dark stone and controlled lighting, the kind of aesthetic that said I don't need to impress you and meant it. An elevator, a floor she wasn't told, a hallway that felt longer than it probably was. A door, and then Cade Thorne. He was standing at a window when she was shown into the room, which she later understood was a deliberate thing, a framing choice, like everything about him was a deliberate choice. He was taller than she'd expected, brooder. The suit was precise in the way that very expensive things are precise, the kind of precision that looks effortless, because so much effort has gone into making it look that way. A scar ran from his jaw down the side of his neck and disappeared beneath his collar. He turned, and she got his face, not handsome exactly. Or not only that, more like a face that had been through something and come out the other side still functional, still controlled, carrying its history in lines around the eyes and the particular set of his mouth. He looked at her the way she looked at a balance sheet, assessing, finding what was there and what wasn't and what the gap might mean. "Miss Vance," he said. "Mr. Thorne," she said. A pause. He seemed to notice something, she wasn't sure what, and one corner of his mouth moved, fractionally. "You're not frightened," he said. "I'm terrified," she said, "but I don't see how showing you that helps me." The fractional movement happened again. He gestured toward a chair. She sat. He didn't. He stayed on his feet, which she noted and catalogued. Power position, deliberate, she'd have done the same, and looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. "Renwick Harwick told me you were a problem," he said. "He tells everyone that when they notice the numbers don't add up, and do your numbers add up? Mine always do," she said. "His don't. That's the issue between us." Something shifted in his face. Not much. But she'd been reading small shifts her whole life. Her mother's moods, Renwick's evasions, the particular way a column of figures tilted when someone had been touching them, and she caught it. "I don't keep people," he said. "In case that's what you were told. It was one of several things I was told. I'm still sorting out which ones are true. You'll have a room here, your own. You'll have access to the common areas. You won't be followed or monitored inside the house." He stopped. "I have certain expectations of discretion. What happens in this building stays in this building." "What happens in this building?" she asked. "Business," he said. "That's all." She looked at him. He was watching her with that balance sheet attention, that quality of reading a situation rather than performing one, and she thought, whatever Renwick told him, it wasn't the whole story. And he knows it. "I'm a bookkeeper," she said. "That's what I do. If you want me here, that's what I am." "I know what you are," Thorne said. "Renwick mentioned the county clerk." A beat. "And," she said, "and nothing, that's your business." He moved toward the door, which was apparently a dismissal. "Margot will show you to your room." He stopped in the doorway, not looking back. "The debt he owes me," he said. "It's not 2.3 million, she went still. "It's 4.1, he said. "He's been undercounting for a while." He left. She sat very still in the expensive chair and thought about numbers and about everything Renwick had not told her. And she felt, underneath the terror and the exhaustion, something else. a small, cold, precise feeling that she recognized from every time she'd caught a discrepancy in a set of accounts. The feeling of knowing exactly where the problem was. The house ran like a machine, or rather like a company, which it essentially was, just one with a legal department that existed in parallel with another legal department that definitely didn't file with the SEC. Astrid understood this within 48 hours. She understood it partly from observation and partly from the fact that she had, without intending to, noticed an error in the supply chain invoicing that was costing Thorne's property arm approximately $60,000 a quarter in duplicate billing from a vendor that appeared twice in the system under different names. She almost said nothing. Then she thought about Renwick's floor molding, and she left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter, which was where, she had gathered, Thorne drank his coffee at 6:15 every morning, with the account numbers circled and the discrepancy noted in the margin. The note was gone by the time she came down at 7. At 7:30, a man named Declan, who ran the legitimate side of the property company and wore the expression of someone permanently disappointed by what he was finding, knocked on the door of the sitting room where she was working and asked if she could explain what she'd found. She explained it. He left without thanking her, which she expected. Thorne appeared in the doorway of the sitting room at 9 that evening. She was still there. She'd been there most of the day. It was comfortable and no one else used it, and he stood in the door and looked at her with that reading a balance sheet attention. The vendor, he said. Halverson Supply, doing business as Halverson Industrial, she said. Same EIN, different trade names. Whoever set up the accounts didn't check. She paused. Or they did check, and they were getting a cut. He was quiet for a moment. Which do you think? He asked. I think the address on both accounts is a UPS store in Hoboken, she said. I think that tells you more than I can. He looked at her. She looked at him. The silence had a quality to it she couldn't quite name. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable, just very present, like both of them were aware of exactly how much was in the air between them and had chosen, separately, not to put it into words. Declan doesn't trust you, he said. Declan doesn't trust anyone who noticed something he didn't notice first, she said. That's his problem, not mine. The corner of his mouth moved. Fair point. He didn't leave. He came into the room. Not close, but into the room, and sat down in the chair across from her, which was so unexpected that she had to work at not showing her surprise. He looked like a man who did not normally sit in sitting rooms. He looked up close, even more like a man who had put his history behind his face and learned to work with what was left. You didn't try to leave, he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. No, why not? She considered this seriously, because she had also considered it seriously when it had mattered. Because running would have been giving Renwick what he wanted, and because she stopped. Because, he said. Because I want access to his accounts, she said. The real ones, not the ones he showed me. I know he's been hiding assets, and I know where some of them are, and I can't prove any of it without documentation I don't have, and documentation is something you might be able to get. The room was very quiet. You're trying to make a deal, he said. I'm trying to balance a ledger, she said. That's what I do. He was quiet for a long moment. She waited. She was good at waiting. What's in it for you? He asked, finally. What do you get? The house, she said, my mother's house. The secondary mortgage he filed was fraudulent. I can prove that, but the legal process takes time and money I don't have. If I get the documentation showing he forged her signature on the filing, it collapses immediately. And you think I have that? I think if anyone has leverage over Renwick Harwick's paper trail, it's the man he owes $4 million to. Another long quiet. He was looking at her like the balance sheet had produced an unexpected result. Not a problem, just something that required recalculation. All right, he said. We'll find out. What followed was not a romance, or it was not only that. It was more like a negotiation that kept producing results neither party had anticipated, a working arrangement that kept working, that kept revealing new layers of what each person was capable of, that kept being more useful than it was supposed to be. Astrid worked. That was the core of it. She worked because it was what she knew how to do, and because Thorne's operations, the legitimate ones, had been maintained at a passable level and could be maintained at a genuinely good level by someone who knew what they were doing. Declan remained cool to her for 6 weeks, and then, after she caught a much larger problem in the contractor invoicing, became coolly respectful, which was probably all she was going to get from him and was fine. She learned the house. She learned its rhythms and its people. The housekeeper, Agnes, who was 70 and deeply competent, and the only person on the staff who had ever spoken to Astrid entirely normally from the first day. A bodyguard named Flynn, who was 25, and from Kilkenny and clearly in the wrong life, but making the best of it, and Thorne himself, who was present in the house perhaps 3 evenings in 7, and who, on the evenings he was there, had the habit of appearing in whatever room she was working in. Not asking for anything, not performing availability, just there, reading documents, drinking the coffee that Agnes made for him in a specific way, sometimes asking her questions that were about work, and sometimes asking questions that were about other things, and she answered all of them with the same precision she brought to the ledgers. She learned things about him that he didn't volunteer, but that became apparent anyway, the way things always did if you paid attention to details. He hadn't slept well in years, maybe ever. She could see it in the quality of his stillness in the evenings, the way he held himself like a man running on infrastructure built for a different kind of pressure. He had a sister somewhere. There were payments, regular and specific, to an address in Burlington, Vermont, and did not talk about her. He had not, so far as Astrid could determine, ever spent money on himself without a practical justification. She caught him, once, looking at the photo she kept on the little desk in her room. Her mother, laughing at someone outside the frame, on a beach that Astrid could still smell if she thought about it hard enough. He wasn't embarrassed to be caught. He just looked at it for another moment and then looked at her. "She looks like someone who expected things to work out," he said. "She did," Astrid said. "She was usually right, usually, until Renwick." He said nothing, but he looked at the photograph one more time before he left. And there was something in the look that she filed away, and didn't examine too carefully for a while. The documentation on Renwick came from a direction she hadn't expected. Not Thorne's people directly, but from a deposition in a civil suit that Thorne's attorney had obtained through a contact at the relevant court. It was 42 pages of financial disclosure, and on page 17, in an exhibit labeled B4, was a copy of the secondary mortgage filing. The signature line read, "Eleanor Vance," her mother's name in her mother's handwriting. Except Astrid had been with her mother for the final 7 months of her life, and she had watched her mother's handwriting change, deteriorate, degrade, become a different thing entirely from what it had been. And the signature on page 17 of Exhibit B4 was not what her mother's handwriting looked like in the last 7 months. It was what it had looked like 5 years before. It was, in other words, old. Renwick had forged it before her mother was even ill. He had planned ahead. Astrid sat at the little desk in her room for a long time, looking at page 17. Agnes brought her tea that she didn't drink. Flynn knocked on the door at some point. She wasn't sure when, and she told him she was fine in a voice that apparently convinced no one, because 20 minutes later, Thorne was in the doorway. She showed him page 17. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at her. "How long ago did he do this?" he asked. 6 years, she said. "At least. You were 17, yes." He sat down across from her, on the edge of her desk, actually, which was a different kind of proximity than the sitting room, and she was aware of it. He put the document down and looked at her face. "This is enough," he said, "for the house. This is enough." "I know," she said. "You don't look like someone who just won something." "I look like someone who just found out how long she's been losing," she said. "It's different." He was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, "I know what that's like." She looked at him. He didn't elaborate, which she hadn't expected him to, but the offering was there, small, deliberate, characteristic of him. "What happens to Renwick?" she asked. "From your end, what do you want to happen?" She thought about this. She thought about the floor molding and the silk blazer at her mother's funeral, and the specific quality of his voice when he told her she was paranoid and ungrateful. "I want him to have to explain himself," she said finally. "Not to a jury, necessarily. Just to someone who isn't going to let him talk his way out of it. I want him to run out of vocabulary." Thorne looked at her for a long moment. "That I can do," he said. "That's actually quite easy." She believed him. That was the thing. She found, sitting there with page 17 in front of her and her mother's name in someone else's handwriting, that she believed him. Not because he'd been consistently kind to her, though he had, in his way, but because in all the months since the night she'd walked out of Renwick's house on her own 2 feet, she had not once caught him in a discrepancy. His numbers added up. Whatever else he was, whatever choices he'd made and what they'd cost, his accounts were honest. That mattered to her more than she expected it to. Renwick's explanation happened, as Thorne had promised, in a format that did not leave room for vocabulary. Thorne's attorney presented the deposition and the forged document to Renwick's attorney on a Tuesday morning. She wasn't there, but she got a precise account later, and the whole thing concluded within 3 weeks with the secondary mortgage dissolved, the legal ownership of the house reverted, and Renwick's various other arrangements with Thorne's organization concluded in a manner that Astrid understood was clean and permanent. Pauline called. Astrid didn't answer. She stood in the house, her mother's house, the one with the oak floors and the window seat in the upstairs bedroom that her mother had lined with old paperbacks, on a Friday afternoon in October, 3 days after the paperwork was finalized. Agnes had come with her. She hadn't asked Agnes to come. Agnes had simply appeared at the car. The house was cold. It had been empty for 2 years and smelled like closed rooms and old heating and the particular staleness of a place waiting to be lived in again. Astrid opened the window in the kitchen, the one that looked out on the back garden, her mother's garden, which had gone wild and was still beautiful, and sat at the table and breathed. Agnes made tea from a bag she'd brought herself. Outside, the garden was all overgrown roses and persistent perennials that had kept going without anyone tending them. "You're not going back," Agnes said. It wasn't quite a question. Astrid thought about this. She thought about the sitting room in Thorne's house, about the particular quality of the silence there in the evenings. She thought about Flynn and Declan and the coffee at 6:15. She thought about a man who appeared in whatever room she was working in and never asked her to explain why she needed to work. "I don't know yet," she said. Agnes drank her tea. She had the excellent quality, in Astrid's experience, of not pressing. Thorne appeared in the doorway of the kitchen at 4:30. He had driven himself, which he apparently did when he didn't want his arrival noted. He looked at the open window and the wild garden and Agnes, who looked back at him with the equanimity of a woman who had seen a great deal. "Agnes," he said. "Mr. Thorne," Agnes said, and stood up and left the room, taking her tea, in the manner of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. He stood in the kitchen. He did not sit down, which was his default. He looked at the garden through the open window for a moment. "The offer still stands," he said. "The position, the arrangements we had." She looked at him. "I don't need the position anymore. The house is mine. I have the documentation." "I know," he said. "So that's not why you're offering." "No," he said. "It's not." The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, some late afternoon birds were conducting business in the overgrown rose bushes. "You're going to tell me this is practical," she said. "Some reason about efficiency or continuity or how the invoicing system still has problems." "The invoicing system does still have problems," he said. "But that's not what I was going to say." She waited. He looked at her across the kitchen, across her mother's kitchen, with the old tile and the window her mother had kept open on warm afternoons, and he said, "I don't run a clean operation. I'm not going to tell you otherwise. There are things I've done and things I continue to do, and I'm not asking you to be all right with all of them." "Okay," she said. "But I keep my accounts honest," he said, "and I pay what I owe, and I—" He stopped. The stop was not a hesitation. It was more like he was checking something, making sure the figure was right before he committed it to the record. "I would like you to stay. Not as a bookkeeper, or not only that." She looked at him for a long moment, I want access to the real accounts, she said. All of them, not just the property arm. Something passed through his express. I know. I'm asking anyway. He was quiet. She waited. All right, he said. Yes, and I keep the house, she said. It stays mine, obviously, he said. I wouldn't touch it. She looked at him. He looked at her. The kitchen held them both without effort. Okay, she said. He came and sat down at the table, at her mother's table, which he'd never seen before, and Agnes, who had clearly been just outside the door, reappeared with 2 cups of tea without being asked. Outside the window, the wild roses held on in the October light, taking up all the space that had been given to them and more, which was the thing about persistent things. They kept going without anyone tending them, kept putting down roots, kept finding what they needed in whatever ground they were given. Astrid looked at Cade Thorne across her mother's table, and she thought, the ledger is even. Not the debt Renwick had created, not the arrangement that had brought her here, but the other kind, the kind that isn't written down anywhere but that everyone is always keeping anyway. For the first time in a long time, she thought it might actually balance.